Trump has a dangerous disability. That was the title of George Will's column that was trending on Twitter today. George Will has often had the most talked about column of the day in his decades as a columnist. Today, there was an urgency to his writing. He said, "It is urgent for Americans to think and speak clearly about President Trump's inability to do either. This seems to be not a mere disinclination, but a disability. The dangerous thing is that he does not know what it is to know something." Joining us now, George F. Will, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. And George, I'm always honored to have you join us on a day like today. I am thrilled to have you join us because, once again, you wrote the column of the day that everyone's talking about. And it's one of those columns that puts into words things that many of us have thought in different ways, but most of us haven't found the way to put it into words. You're saying that the president is actually not able to think.
Well, the problem, Lawrence, isn't just that his sentences don't parse and that his pronouns float around in search of antecedents. It's not just that he's syntactically challenged. Dwight Eisenhower occasionally was, although I think his opacity was sometimes tactical. It's not just that he's given to verbal fender benders. George W. Bush had his share of those. The question is whether or not the way he talks and the judgments he makes about matters of fact, history, for example, suggests that he really is not capable of sequential thought, which is rather alarming in a president. You add that to the fact that his demonstrated lack of knowledge of American history, his recent talk about Andrew Jackson being angry about a civil war that occurred 16 years after he died, suggests that again, he's a basic unfamiliarity not just with our past, but with our present. Remember, during the Republican candidates debates, he said once, in defending the conservatism of his sister, who's a federal judge, he said that his sister had signed some of the same bills that Justice Alito had signed on the Supreme Court. Now, that suggests that he would flunk a 6th grade civics exam because he suggests that federal judges and Supreme Court justices sign bills. This is rather alarming. I mean, if next week he comes out and says, Grover Cleveland was a stern critic of the New Deal. On the one hand, we'll be all pleased and surprised to know that he knows there was a President Grover Cleveland, but there comes a point at which this manages to be ludicrous without being at all funny. When you have a president who doesn't understand the basic facts of American history, the basic realities of American governance, and finds it impossible to put into simple declarative sentences what he's talking about.
I want to listen to a professional diagnosis here. This is from Lance Dodas, a former professor at Harvard Medical School, professor of psychiatry. Let's listen to what he had to say about the president on this show.
Lying in the way that he does it, repeated, dangerous lying, makes him unfit and is a sign of serious mental disturbance. And to the extent he doesn't know reality, and I agree, by the way, I don't think he does know reality clearly. He doesn't have a clear grasp of it because he changes it. He makes up reality to suit his internal needs.
George, your column scrupulously avoided any diagnosis that you're not medically qualified to make. But were you tempted? I feel your column goes right up to the border of psychiatry.
Well, I stopped there purposely. First place, I'm not qualified. Second, I remember the gross abuse of psychiatry when my man Barry Goldwater, for whom I cast my first presidential vote, was running for president in 1964, and a whole slew of psychiatrists diagnosed him from a distance as having all kinds of authoritarian and other disagreeable behaviors and tendencies. I didn't want to engage in that. I'm just going by the evidence that the president continues to put in front of us in torrential amounts.
And your recommendation at the close of your column is, quote, for the public to quarantine this presidency. How can the public do that?
Well, the public has to communicate to their elected representatives that the elected representatives have more to fear from the public, from their constituents, than they do from Mr. Trump. That is, the public has to say, we have taken this man's measure and we find him alarming, and we want you to be on our side, the side of our alarm and our rational fear, rather than the normal tendency to defer to presidents on important matters, particularly war and peace. I mean, it's one thing for him to wander around and say, my gosh, who knew healthcare was complicated? It's another thing when he's dealing with North Korea, the South China Sea, the Ukraine, Crimea, and all the rest, when the use of force is involved, because that requires, a certain confidence on the part of the public to support a president, and because the normal Madisonian checks and balances simply do not restrain presidents when it comes to the use of military force.
And George, based on what you're hearing from elected officials in Washington, is that message from the public, because certainly many members of the public already feel this, what you're talking about in your column, and have been trying to communicate it to their elected representatives, is that message getting through?
I think it is. The important thing is that it get through to Republicans. If the Democrats have gone into well-advertised resistance. The real question is, will Republicans in Congress feel a need to defer? I think not. Now, you noticed the other day the president, when he broke new ground in presidential behavior by urging a governmental shutdown, said also, which is really none of his business coming from the executive branch, that the Senate should change its rules to get rid of the filibuster. There was an instant and bipartisan rejection of that, which indicated that Republicans, as well as Democrats, are finding a common ground in establishing a distance and an institutional self-interest against Mr. Trump.
George F. Will has once again written the column of the day that everyone's talking about. George, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
Coming up.